This image is familiar to everyone. A remote, untouched mountain range, monumental granite reaching up into the clouds. Since childhood, we have been taught that mountains are a symbol of eternity and immutability. They seem like the perfect natural shield, capable of protecting us from any disaster.
We are sold the idea of an absolute stronghold.
But the mountain is a disguise. If you get close to the rock, you can hear a low-frequency hum. It's not the wind, it's the sound of turbines running. Behind millions of tons of stone lies not salvation, but a trap of colossal proportions. Thousands of tons of shifting earth, a lethal level of carbon dioxide, seismic resonance that turns the walls into shrapnel, claustrophobia that shatters the mind. This is not just a shelter in the rock. It is an autonomous mechanism, a massive life support prosthesis implanted into dead rock.
It is an instrument of supreme power, created to survive the end of the world, but which ultimately began to devour its own creators.
By the end of this story, it will become clear why the most secure place on the planet is also the most fragile. You will understand what it means to be trapped inside a machine that cannot forgive mistakes. But first, we must go back to the starting point, to that moment when there were no titanium airlocks, no nuclear fear, no megawatt diesel engines, only cold stone and a primal terror of the open sky. The sky suddenly ceased to be safe when death began to rain down from above in the form of aerial bombs. Familiar architecture instantly lost all meaning. Ordinary concrete roofs on the ground became easy targets for fire control officers. People had to seek reliable protection where no modern bomb could reach. The military engineer's gaze naturally turned deep underground. The idea seemed flawless in its absolute simplicity, to use the planet itself as powerful natural armor. The mountain was perceived by the designers as an endless and free monolith. It was believed that such a mass could absorb a strike of any magnitude and protect those inside. Thus began humanity's large-scale and decisive incursion into ancient geology. The first designs for underground bases were extremely pragmatic and deliberately crude. The builders faced only one task: to drill a deep tunnel through solid rock. They planned to secretly house strategic command centers and military factories there.
No one thought about people's comfort. Everyone was concerned only with the thickness of the stone ceilings.
But this bold idea had an inherent physical limitation that could not be ignored. A mountain is by no means an empty box that can be easily filled with things. It is an extremely dense and highly unstable environment that operates by its own laws. To create even a modicum of usable space inside the mountain, millions of cubic meters of heavy rock had to be excavated. Every meter reclaimed from the mountain meant a rapid retreat from natural light and fresh air. The pressure inside these enclosed spaces became abnormal and differed significantly from atmospheric pressure. In those years, protection was measured solely by the depth of the structure. In practice, however, such depth was synonymous with constant suffocation and discomfort. The architects of the first bunkers quickly faced a terrifying engineering paradox. The deeper they dug into the rock to escape external threats, the more hostile the environment inside became. The mountain had absolutely no intention of tolerating an artificial void within its body for long.
It began to actively resist any human interference.
The mountain mass began to exert colossal pressure on the created chambers. Millions of tons of granite, solid basalt, and limestone constantly sought to close in. The immense load tried to instantly fill any excavated caverns and passages. The rock creaked menacingly and crumbled, reminding us that gravity works without days off or holidays. Added to this destructive pressure was the ever-present groundwater. Hidden rivers and capillary moisture persistently sought any way out of their stony prison. The mountain literally oozed with icy water, turning the first tunnels into damp caves unfit for human habitation. The authorities realized that the rock could not simply be broken through. It also had to be somehow supported. How could they prevent the mountain from crushing those seeking refuge within it? Construction turned into an exhausting and protracted battle against the laws of physics. Heavy tunneling shields gnawed at the hard rock, leaving jagged wounds in the ancient stone. The air in the cramped tunnels was constantly thick with acrid granite dust and exhaust fumes from the machinery. Workers labored at the limits of human endurance in conditions of complete darkness and dampness. Every meter of progress cost enormous effort and resources. All the rock extracted to the surface had to be carefully and skillfully hidden. It was impossible to simply dump millions of tons of rubble at the foot of the mountain in plain sight. Such carelessness would instantly expose the secret facility when viewed from the air. The rock was secretly hauled away at night and evenly scattered across distant valleys. The entire process of building the bunker was an act of massive and extremely costly deception. To counter the mounting pressure from the mountain, engineers began pouring concrete into the interior spaces. Hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of special mortar were pumped under immense pressure beneath the arches. They formed a second, entirely artificial skin inside each stone sack. This shell was intended to bear the bulk of the mountain mass's weight and prevent it from collapsing.
The concrete pouring proceeded around the clock to deny the rock time to shift.
But the construction technologies of that time were still extremely primitive. The concrete set extremely unevenly under conditions of high and constant underground humidity. Microscopic voids inevitably remained between the natural rock and the artificial concrete arches. These gaps became the main sources of future problems for the entire structure. Air and condensation accumulated in them, destroying the material's structure. Aggressive groundwater immediately rushed into these cavities. It carried dissolved salts and minerals that began to quietly corrode the steel reinforcement. The corrosion process began on the very day the facility was officially commissioned. Engineers realized that the service life of such structures would be much shorter than desired. Water slowly but surely turned the sturdy metal into rusty dust. To ensure people could breathe, deep vertical shafts had to be drilled. These were narrow, long air shafts connecting the deep underground with the atmosphere. Through these openings, powerful industrial fans forced cold mountain air down to the work sites. Without this forced ventilation system, people would not have been able to survive inside for more than a few hours.
The hum of the motors became a constant companion of underground life.
During the design process, engineers constantly had to make difficult compromises. They deliberately narrowed the corridors to save as much as possible on the excavation of heavy soil. They often skimped on quality insulation, blindly relying on the immense thickness of the rock. These were crude and truly harsh spaces, created solely for cold survival. In such interiors, there was no room for aesthetics or human warmth. Every technical decision was dictated by a severe time crunch and a panic-stricken fear of a major war. The bunkers were built as purely temporary shelters, capable of withstanding only a brief air raid. None of the designers anticipated that people would have to live in these concrete boxes for years. But what would happen to these structures if a temporary shelter became a permanent home for decades? When the last scaffolding was finally dismantled, the long-awaited moment of great triumph arrived. Huge steel gates, a full meter thick, slowly and majestically closed on powerful hydraulic hinges. The dull, heavy sound of their closing signaled to everyone present a final severance from the rest of the world. From that moment on, the people found themselves locked inside a man-made capsule deep underground. Inside the rooms, a steady, cold, and absolutely sterile electric light instantly flared up. High-ranking generals and influential politicians solemnly walked through the echoing concrete corridors of their new refuge.
They gazed with undisguised admiration at the thick walls and massive, airtight bulkheads.
Before them stretched endless rows of control panels and indicators, promising complete control over any situation. At that moment, everyone present was overcome by an intoxicating and almost religious sense of absolute invulnerability. 300 meters of solid, unbroken granite overhead seemed to everyone the surest guarantee of eternity. No modern conventional bomb or heavy artillery shell could even scratch this stone armor. It seemed that here, down below, humanity had finally found complete safety from any earthly threats. The bunker quickly became the authorities' primary symbol of definitive and irrevocable control over the world. In those airtight chambers, secret maps were drawn up on enormous tables, and global strategies were planned in minute detail. The ringing silence of the deep underground gave the commanders a dangerous illusion of clear thinking and complete calm. The entire outside world, with all its risks and uncertainties, remained somewhere out there, infinitely far above. The enclosed space was completely filled with the sharp smell of ozone, machine oil, and fresh industrial paint. All engineering systems were operating normally, causing not the slightest concern among the technicians. The ventilation hummed evenly and monotonously, creating a distinctive white noise that strangely soothed the inhabitants' nerves. Life beneath the mountains seemed like a well-oiled machine that would never suffer a serious breakdown. It seemed that the perfect physical formula for survival in modern warfare had finally been found. People sincerely believed they had managed to outwit the harshest realities of war by hiding safely deep within the planet. The mountain came to be perceived by the military not as a fearsome force of nature, but as an obedient tool and a submissive shield.
People felt like masters of the underground realm, protected from any of history's whims.
The external appearance of the completed facility fully and in every way matched the leadership's boldest expectations. It was a fortress of an entirely new type, where the walls were not built of brick, but carved directly into the rock. It was a true apotheosis of mid-century engineering, the pinnacle of human skill and perseverance. The structure appeared to be a monolithic monument to the power of the human spirit, capable of conquering even the hardest granite. However, at that solemn moment, no one yet realized that all this monumentality was merely a beautiful and static image. No one realized that the mountain was by no means a dead and immovable rock. In reality, it was an extremely dynamic and constantly shifting physical environment. The main and most terrifying threat to this refuge would not come from outside at all, but would originate in its own depths. The beautiful illusion of eternal safety collapsed on the day when the very physics of warfare changed radically. The familiar kilotons of explosives were suddenly replaced by devastating megatons of nuclear energy. The new weapons no longer merely blew up concrete fortifications and pierced armor. Now they possessed the ability to instantly vaporize entire swaths of the surface, along with mountains and cities. This new type of global threat instantly rendered all previous engineering calculations and hopes obsolete. A powerful thermonuclear explosion on the surface of a mountain created a shockwave of unprecedented force. The immense energy flowing into the ground caused solid rock to behave like a viscous liquid. Under such an impact, Granite began to vibrate and shift, transforming from a shield into a source of mortal danger. The mountain no longer served as a solid and reliable shield for those within its depths. On the contrary, it became the perfect conduit for a massive seismic shockwave throughout the entire structure. The kinetic energy of the explosion traveled through the granite at the speed of sound, heading straight for the voids inside. Every corridor and every hall now absorbed a monstrous resonance capable of shattering the concrete lining from within. In these new realities, it became necessary to urgently and radically re-equip all underground facilities. The authorities quickly realized that they would now have to remain in the bunker not for a few hours, but for months or even years. Total radiation contamination of the surface made a quick return to the familiar world practically impossible. The bunker had to become a fully self-sufficient city, capable of sustaining life in conditions of complete isolation. A continuous stream of new secret apparatus and complex equipment poured into the dark underground. Endless rows of teletypes and the first bulky computers were installed in the halls. Following the powerful machines, new people arrived at the bunker, hundreds of operators, analysts, and military technicians. The population density in the enclosed spaces began to rise rapidly, placing an unprecedented strain on the entire facility. The secret facility began to rapidly take on a multitude of new and unplanned functions. From a simple temporary shelter, it was finally transformed into a global and complex command center. The load on life support, water supply, and air filtration systems increased tenfold. The equipment was operating at the limits of its technical capabilities, constantly requiring repairs and special attention. The new computers began to emit a colossal amount of waste heat into the confined space. The vacuum tube computers of that generation heated the surrounding air to the point of a veritable hot sauna. Hundreds of people, locked in this cramped and confined space, were constantly breathing, raising the humidity level. Carbon dioxide levels in the far compartments began to slowly but surely approach a level dangerous to health. The bunker began to literally suffocate from its own intense activity. The old ventilation shafts, carved into the rock, were physically unable to handle the outflow of such a large volume of hot air. Wires and communication cables began to melt under the strain, creating a risk of short circuits and fire. The system, which was originally designed to save lives, began methodically generating death from within its own walls. Could the mind overcome the heat trap it had created? The rocky shell, which for decades was supposed to reliably protect people, suddenly turned into a treacherous weapon of mass destruction. Nuclear physicists performed new calculations and discovered an effect that sent the top military leadership into a state of shock. This physical phenomenon was given a short and frightening name: the rebound. It turned out that the colossal mass of the mountain could work against those who had hidden in its depths. When a seismic wave from a powerful nuclear explosion passes through the rock and reaches the bunker's internal void, an instantaneous release of energy occurs. The vault of the underground cavern, which is rigidly bonded to the concrete lining, simply cannot withstand such a dynamic impact. At that moment, the inner surface of the walls literally explodes inward into the living quarters and work areas. This happens in a fraction of a second, leaving people not the slightest chance of survival. Thousands of razor-sharp pieces of granite and heavy concrete shoot into the enclosed space at the speed of a real bullet. Even if the main structure of the bunker itself does not collapse completely, everything living and technical inside will be instantly riddled with sharp stone. The mountain will, in the literal sense, fire into itself with all its might. This discovery forced engineers to completely rethink the safety concept for underground command centers. In addition to the physical threat of destruction, a serious thermodynamic problem arose. The thick concrete walls, tightly pressed against the mountain rock, began to accumulate excess heat from the operating equipment. The rock ceased to radiate its usual cold. It gradually heated up itself from the constant operation of powerful servers and generators. The temperature in the lowest levels of the facility began to rise steadily. This created a real threat of the insulation on critical power cables melting. The facility's complex cooling systems were operating at their limits and were literally choking under the load. To effectively cool the scorching air in the enclosed spaces, engineers needed a massive amount of water. However, the underground reservoirs themselves quickly overheated, turning into giant boilers of boiling water. A terrifying threat arose that the expensive equipment would simply burn alive before the first enemy bomb even hit the surface. The psychological strain on the bunker's personnel also reached an all-time high. Every day, the men were under constant psychological pressure from the millions of tons of rock above their heads. All of this took place amid mounting heat and the endless mechanical hum of the powerful life support systems. The former sense of absolute safety had finally given way to the oppressive feeling that they were all buried alive in this stone tomb. To make matters worse, the so-called air tightness trap emerged, becoming a nightmare for the duty shifts. If the external sensors on the mountain's surface detected even the slightest radiation, the massive ventilation valves would automatically slam shut. The bunker instantly switched to full internal air circulation mode. From that moment on, the facility became a completely isolated system, cut off from any external resources. It was at this fateful moment that an invisible death timer began ticking for all the inhabitants of the underground facility. The supply of breathable oxygen inside a sealed volume is always finite and strictly limited. The air regeneration systems consumed a colossal amount of scarce electrical energy to operate. But the heavy diesel generators also vitally needed fresh air for the combustion process. An insoluble technical conflict arose. Either people would breathe, or the machines would produce the necessary electricity. The entire underground system eventually teetered on the very edge of a dangerous precipice. This was by no means the result of some sudden accident or a mistake by a specific operator. It was the mathematically inevitable outcome of the facility's endless expansion and increasing complexity. The once perfect bunker ceased to be a reliable refuge and had finally turned into a trap of flawless strength. Escaping from it in the event of a real conflict could become impossible. Regular technical inspections revealed a truly catastrophic picture of the facility's condition to the specialists. Numerous micro-cracks in the rock were caused by sharp temperature fluctuations and immense pressure. Over time, these cracks began to widen, compromising the overall integrity of the rock mass. Ground moisture, mixed with chemicals from engine oil and diesel fuel, began to rapidly corrode the main load-bearing structures. During large-scale training drills, when the facility was completely sealed off, the situation became critical. Temperatures in the central control rooms reached dangerous levels after just a few hours of operation. People often lost consciousness from the unbearable heat and acute lack of fresh oxygen right at their combat posts. It became clear that in a real combat situation, the personnel simply would not be able to perform their direct duties. It became obvious to top leadership. If the airlock doors closed in the midst of an actual war, the bunker would not save the command. It would simply cook everyone alive as if in a giant pressure cooker. Or the structure would crush its occupants with flying debris at the very first powerful seismic shock from an explosion. Old-school engineering had reached a dead end in the face of new physical threats. The very concept of monolithic, rigidly anchored concrete structures attached to the rock suffered a complete collapse. Being a single, immovable unit with the mountain meant a guaranteed death along with that mountain. A rigid and brittle structure stood no chance against the destructive kinetic energy of a megaton blast. To survive, the bunker had to cease being part of the rock and become something fundamentally different. At that moment, the government found itself in a deep strategic impasse. Billions of state funds had been spent on construction, and entire secret metropolises had been dug deep underground. But the actual security of key command centers ultimately turned out to be practically zero. Leaving everything as it was now was tantamount to conscious collective suicide in the event of a conflict. Immediate and radical surgical intervention into the very architecture of the underground structures was required. It was necessary, at all costs, to break free from the deadly embrace of ancient stone and cold concrete. The engineers faced an almost impossible task to teach the heavy bunker to move and absorb shocks inside the mountain. But how could they make thousands of tons of concrete float inside the rock mass without touching its walls? The engineers proposed a solution that seemed insane at first glance, but was the only viable one under those conditions: to create a bunker within a bunker. It was essential to definitively separate the living and working modules from the rigid and dangerous rock at all costs. The main idea was to leave a protective void between the mountain and the human space. This empty space was intended to act as a shock absorber, dampening any external vibrations and impacts. A massive and incredibly complex reconstruction of all underground utilities began. Inside the huge excavated caverns, workers began erecting completely independent and self-contained steel structures. These were full-fledged multi-story buildings constructed from special armored steel and the latest high-strength alloy. In essence, an entirely new city was being built inside the mountain, one that had no rigid connection to its granite foundation. The most important thing was that these futuristic structures did not touch the walls or the vault of the cave at all. These massive, multi-ton buildings were mounted on giant steel springs of a special hardening. Each such spring weighed several tons on its own and was as thick as a human torso. This entire complex structure now literally hovered in the void, supported only by its powerful shock absorbers. The main idea behind the whole scheme was the effective and instantaneous absorption of any external impact. If a monstrous shockwave were to shake the mountain, the rock would tremble violently and even partially crumble. However, the steel structures inside would simply sway gently on their giant springs, completely dissipating the deadly kinetic energy. Thus, the bunker's inhabitants could survive a magnitude 10 earthquake without even noticing it. It was a true triumph of the biomechanical engineering of that era. The dead and cold bunker had finally acquired its own artificial joints and elastic cartilage. A dangerous rockfall was now practically no threat to the personnel or equipment. Sharp rocks would fall into the designated void without touching the steel capsules, where people continued to work undisturbed. To effectively solve the problem of unbearable heat between the rock and the buildings, a complex system of constant air circulation was created. All the technological voids were now used as giant cooling jackets for the entire structure. Powerful streams of cold air constantly washed over the steel walls, drawing excess heat away from the equipment and people. This allowed for a stable and comfortable temperature to be maintained inside the modules, even when the systems were operating at full capacity. The interior of the modules came to strongly resemble the high-tech interior of an interplanetary spaceship. Everywhere, sharp lines, rapid modular assembly, and the cold sheen of high-quality metal prevailed. The mountain had finally ceased to be a home, becoming merely an outer, disposable shell for the ultra-complex mechanism hidden inside. Humans had created their own habitat, completely isolated from the influence of the Earth's crust. But every grand innovation always carries its own immense hidden burden and its own price. By separating the bunker from the mountain, the engineers unwittingly and repeatedly complicated the entire life support system. Salvation from one threat immediately spawned a cascade of new, even more sophisticated and dangerous vulnerabilities. Every technical solution required ever-increasing resources and attention to maintain operability. The giant springs on which the steel buildings now proudly rested proved, in practice, to be extremely finicky to operate. Under the influence of a constant and colossal static load, the heavy metal began to gradually accumulate internal fatigue. Thousands of highly complex shock absorbers required regular inspection, thorough lubrication, and timely, costly replacement. The slightest crack in a single spring could cause the entire high-rise block to skew. To maintain these finicky mechanisms, the authorities had to create a separate army of specially trained technicians. These people worked their shifts crawling through the narrow, damp, and pitch-black crevices between the rock and the building foundations. Every movement they made carried the risk of being crushed by the slightest jolt. The attempt to escape the mountain's pressure only led to a new, total dependence on the quality of the steel and the precision of the mechanics' work. But the most critical and painful Achilles heel of the entire facility was the completely new ventilation system. To fully cool this enormous underground city on springs, truly gigantic volumes of fresh air from the surface were required. The air intake shafts became truly enormous, turning into wide tunnels stretching up into the sky. This was necessary for life, but deadly dangerous from the standpoint of camouflage. These massive openings instantly became perfect targets for any high-precision enemy weapon. A random explosion near such an air intake could instantly drive an uncontrollable firestorm into the facility. To prevent such a catastrophe, massive blast-proof valves were installed at all entrances. These were heavy steel flaps designed to snap shut automatically within a fraction of a second in response to a sudden pressure change. But any mechanical system, no matter how reliable it may seem, is inherently imperfect. The slightest valve jam or a random grain of sand in the hydraulics could cause the bunker to simply burn from the inside out. The entire safety system was hanging by a thread. Valves that were too open left you vulnerable to gas and radiation, while valves that were too tightly closed meant you would suffocate very quickly. Moreover, by removing so much excess rock to create protective buffer zones, the engineers had seriously weakened the mountain structure itself. The natural arches of the man-made caves became extremely unstable and began to slowly collapse. They had to be hastily reinforced with thousands of steel anchors several meters long and secured with sturdy metal mesh. The mountain, which they had so long and persistently gutted, now itself was in dire need of constant support and reinforcement. Will this colossus remain standing, or will it one day decide to finally close its stone jaws? The structure had finally mutated. It had lost its original simplicity of rough stone and thick concrete. It had turned into a fragile, painfully complex ecosystem that demanded constant, obsessive care. A new, invisible threat had emerged, an electromagnetic pulse. A flash in the atmosphere could burn out all the delicate electronics in the command center right through the rock. New layers of protection had to be created. Every steel building inside the cave was sheathed in solid copper sheets, turning them into Faraday cages. The bunker became deaf and blind. Communication with the outside world now depended on kilometers of fiber optic cable laid in armored conduits to the surface. Cut the wire, and the authorities would be blinded within their perfect shelter. Energy dependence became absolute. The bunker could no longer just stand there. Without electricity, the pumps that drained groundwater stopped. Without electricity, the ventilation died. If the supply of diesel fuel from the surface stopped, life in the underground city would grind to a halt within a few weeks. Autonomy turned out to be an illusion. It was not independence from the world, but a death sentence on a strict timer. The very essence of the bunker had changed. It had become a life support machine for the elite, an exorbitantly expensive incubator that consumed the resources of an entire region simply to maintain a state of standby. Today, these gigantic underground complexes exist in a state of paradox. Some of them have been abandoned. Without constantly running pumps, nature is quickly reclaiming its territory. Black, icy water slowly floods the lower levels, engulfing rusting springs, abandoned server racks, and rotting airlock doors. The mountain is digesting what has been thrust into it. But the operational facilities have reached the pinnacle of technological absurdity. These are no longer gloomy caves. They are blindingly white data centers, flooded with LED light, where the hum of servers merges with the roar of turbines. The people who work here may go weeks without seeing the sun. They maintain a system designed to protect the equipment that controls a world that may no longer exist on the surface. They are surrounded by millions of sensors. The system monitors everything, from millimeter-scale shifts in tectonic plates to the chemical composition of the operator's sweat. Security has been taken to the level of clinical paranoia. The authorities have locked themselves in a perfect cage. On the outside, it is a rock, an impenetrable monolith. Inside, it is an endless cycle of inspections, filter replacements, water pumping, and the fight against entropy. This is the infrastructure of the apocalypse, which demands daily sacrifices in the form of colossal budgets and man-hours. The bunker has become not a place of salvation, but a place of eternal, exhausting defense against time itself. Some of them are not marked on the map. Look at the mountain again. At that silent, untouched profile against the sky. The stone seems cold and indifferent, but beneath this stony skin, nerves of fiber optics are stretched taut. There, in the eternal darkness, steel buildings weighing thousands of tons groan faintly on gigantic springs. There, air is filtered and fuel is burned for a single purpose: to preserve the illusion of control. There is no such thing as absolute armor. Every attempt to shut oneself off from the world gives rise to a new, even more complex fragility. Power, driven underground, acquires a physical weight that begins to press down on it. These structures are not just holes in the rock, they are cities inside mountains, and one day, the mountain will take them back.